Welcome to CaptiolView on WSIU. I'm Brian Sapp. This week, Governor J.B. Pritzker gives his budget address to the General Assembly. Illinois has already been challenged with a tight budget. Now the governor and General Assembly have to work through funding cuts coming from Washington, D.C. And early voting is underway, and we're a month away from the primary election. The Republican Senate candidates took part in a debate trying to make their pitch to primary voters. Joining us today are Peter Hancock, he's a reporter with Capital News Illinois, and Jeremy Garner, he's a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Peter and Jeremy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Good to see you guys. Gets kind of busy. I know you guys have been busy there in Springfield, but the pace seems to be picking up. We normally do record these on Wednesday, so this would have been recorded before the governor gives his address, and we're recording even a day earlier because of that address. But I think there's been lots of talk. I think we kind of know a lot of things that the governor's going to talk about. So, Jeremy, let's start with you. You wrote an article this weekend looking at the challenges. What are you looking for as the governor gives his address and talks about the budget?
Well, I think let's look at what happened a year ago, right? I mean, he used his State of the State and budget address as a national platform to warn Illinoisans about President Trump's threats to democracy, likening the Trump administration to that of Nazi-era Germany. That obviously raised antennas and, Republicans who roundly criticized the governor for that rhetoric. Keep in mind, Trump had been in office probably for about a month in his second term at that point. The difference is that the governor's warnings about President Trump last year rather, the way he sees it have become a reality. In addition to threats to democracy he's talked about with the Trump administration, he's also warned about federal uncertainty for funding for Illinois. By last fall's estimate, the state faced a budget gap of around $2.2 billion. That is a figure that varies, but we've seen lawsuit after lawsuit filed by Attorney General Kwame Raoul. There's been dozens in the last year alone. Every time President Trump threatens to deprive Illinois of federal funding in areas of education, healthcare, you name it, there's lawsuits that have been filed to try to stop that, and they've been fairly successful so far. But we're obviously with this the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed by Republicans last year, championed by President Trump. The big issue that we're going to see there is cuts to SNAP benefits and Medicaid. I believe the bipartisan Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability came out with a report saying that by I believe in the early 2030s, by then Illinois could by then have lost out on more than $6 billion in Medicaid benefits because of moves from the Trump administration. In response, you've had a slew of Democrats who are, ringing the bell saying like, okay, well, we basically need to push a message of affordability. The state of Illinois has become too expensive for Illinoisans in the meantime. And to that end, you've seen a number of Democrats push to revive a graduated millionaires tax, something that's been passed through advisory referendum on two separate occasions in the last decade or decade and a half or so. But it has not passed through the General Assembly. So, we're hearing more calls, especially from progressive Democrats, to enact a more fair tax system, taxing the wealthy, so that, new taxes and tax hikes don't fall on the backs of working class families. That's been really kind of the message from Democrats right now. And, as we're seeing prices increase under the Trump administration, from groceries to gasoline. So we're seeing that. And, and as far as for education funding goes, There's Democrats who are pushing for more education funding through the evidence-based funding formula, which is supposed to prioritize underfunded public school districts, including the Chicago public schools. For most of the time that this law has been in effect since 2017, or since the governor has been in office in 2019, he's pushed for the minimum mandatory increase of $350 million. And there's been renewed calls to increase that to up to $1 billion annually. But so we'll see what happens. And, they also have, the state has obligations for the pension fund. Right now they have more than $140 billion, more than $144 billion, or around $144 billion in unfunded pension liabilities. And, the governor wants to revive a key policy to address that from 2024, which basically would move the target from 90% to 100% fully funded to 2048 instead of 2045, for example. But I know that's so far received a lukewarm reception from at least one of the legislative leaders who's questioning. I know Senate President Don Harmon saying, we'll see how tight this budget is going to be, because again, it goes back to a big part of it is, what does the federal funding picture look like for the next year? And I think it's right now it's anybody's guess.
Okay, from your seat, thank you, Jeremy. From your seat, Peter, what have you seen in your reporting and some of your coverage areas there?
Well, I would agree with a lot of what Jeremy said. I think, the overall message that we're going to get, I think, is that we are living through a time when the total relationship between the federal government and state governments is being redefined. Arguably, right now, it's being redefined in kind of a haphazard, partisan political way, but it is being redefined, especially when it comes to funding things like healthcare, education, safety net services, these kinds of things. And so in the short term, that has put a big question mark over the budget that Governor Pritzker is going to present and that lawmakers are going to have to debate during this upcoming session, because all states rely on the federal government revenue sharing to fund some of these things that are joint responsibilities of the state and federal government. And right now there's a huge question mark over that. So I think we're probably going to see a budget proposal that is fairly lean, fairly cautious, simply because we don't know what to expect from the federal government over the next year to year and a half, or even 2 years. So that's going to be the hallmark, I think, of, budget-wise, the debate coming up through this session.
Okay. Let's stick with the General Assembly. There's bills making their way as we were getting ready to air. We're talking about bills just being brought to committee and whether or not they're going to make it. And this is that time where people are finding lots of bills to report on. But one that you reported on, Peter, was the governor talked about this last fall, was home insurance, giving legislators in the state a little more say over and authority over home insurance rates. Can you tell us what that bill might be and where it stands and whether it could pass?
Yeah, so this came on the heels of State Farm announcing last year overall about a 27.2% increase in homeowner insurance rates in the state of Illinois. It upset a lot of people, including Governor Pritzker, who basically accused the company of cost shifting, that is, taking disaster-related losses in states like California, the wildfires, hurricanes in Florida and Texas, and shifting those onto the backs of consumers in Illinois, something that the insurance industry strongly denies. But it did sort of highlight the fact that Illinois has a fairly lax regulatory environment when it comes to homeowners insurance. And so there was this bill came up in the fall that Pritzker had asked for that would give the State Department of Insurance regulatory authority to review rate increases, to require that insurance companies give consumers 60-day notice if there's going to be a 10% or more increase in their rates, and giving the department authority to, after the fact, reject rate increases and even order rebates to consumers if they thought the rates were excessive. And this has the insurance industry very, very concerned. It came up in the fall. Procedurally, it was kind of complicated. The Senate took a bill that had already passed the House. They put this, gutted that bill, put this language into it, passed it, sent it back to the House. And on the final day, the House was supposed to vote to concur in the Senate amendments. Somebody didn't do the vote counting in advance. The vote fell short of the votes it needed to pass. So it failed on the floor of the House, which is something you don't see very often. But there was immediately a motion filed the next day, basically to reconsider that, which you can do under House rules one time. So there is a sense the insurance industry says they have heard that it could come up very early this week or possibly next week, but they're confident that there's going to be another attempt to pass this bill.
Since it didn't pass last time, have they made any changes to try to get it more people behind it?
Well, that's it. The bill is the same as it was when it was on the table back in October. If it fails again, I would suspect that new legislation will be drafted and it will have to go through the committee process all over again. But right now, it's the same bill, the same language that could come up at any point, or in the first week or so of the session.
Okay, well, we'll see if anybody's had their mind changed on that. I wanted to we'll stick with you, and then if Jeremy has any thoughts. Another bill that's been proposed last week was a new power. It's called the Power Act, to address some of the concerns that people have had with data centers. Can you give us a little bit of background on what this bill is and what we could see?
Yeah, it's sort of ironic that it was only a few years ago, I want to say maybe 2019, 2020, when the state was actively recruiting these data centers. At the time, these were popping up all over the country. They're places basically that house large servers that store data. It is essentially the cloud, as they call it in computer lingo. But since then, we've seen this explosion in artificial intelligence development, which is, we all know what it is, but what a lot of people don't know is that it consumes huge amounts of electricity. And so as these data centers are going into communities, they're putting huge new load on the power grid, the local power grid, as well as on local water supplies to cool the engines, the electronic equipment that keeps all this stuff running. And it's caused a lot of concern in a lot of communities where this is happening, fear that these data centers are ultimately going to drive up electricity rates by putting such, increased demand on the power grid. And so this bill would essentially make data centers pay for their own power or come up with their own power sources, I suppose, as well as make them more answerable to their use of water resources. So it's an amazing sort of turn of events in just a very short period of time. How, at one time we couldn't wait to get these things into the state because they are, very valuable developments that could, generate new property taxes and jobs and everything else. But now people are realizing that they actually do come with a considerable social cost in terms of electricity and water resources.
Definitely, like you said, I can think back to, let's bring these here. Let's, the jobs and ideas like that. But I think it's just part of the process and seeing some of the impacts, and we'll see what the legislature is able to come up with on this front. Jeremy, I'm going to switch our topics here. When we were talking, you said you've really been focused on this budget address and then elections. And last week, the three Senate candidates on the Republican side had a debate on Fox 32, I believe, in Chicago, and you wrote a little bit about that. Were they able to get their message out effectively and kind of set themselves apart?
I think it was a little difficult to do that in just an hour, under an hour. There's so many more questions that that I'm sure the moderators could have asked. But basically what you have, and the crux of our story was that was really where the moderators tried to challenge the three candidates to see if they have any disagreements with President Trump. And none of the three wanted to go there overtly. They obviously wanted to talk, more positively about, why they agree with his policies. I mean, remember, U.S. Senate's a federal office. They'd be working with the president or with the executive branch, as far as securing the border, especially and also, trying to be, fiscally responsible with, especially with this one big beautiful bill, depending on the Republican perspective of things. I know that bill has, been, very, a lot of high emotions on both ends of the aisle there. But at the same time, we saw that there were, candidates were open to different approaches to how President Trump, is doing things. Like, well, for instance, when it comes to elections, they have a thing that's kind of percolating right now in Washington called the SAVE Act, which would it's an election omnibus bill that will require photo ID in elections and also require proof of citizenship. And while the candidates appeared to really favor the legislation in concept, there was some concern about how would elections still be left to the states, which is the normal practice that's enshrined in federal law, because they're worried about how this the president wants to nationalize elections with this law. But but still, we saw. I know, like, afterwards, in the spin room, I saw that got a little time to get better to get to know some of these candidates. Jeannie Evans is from the South Side of Chicago. I think she's originally from the West Coast. She's an antitrust lawyer. I did ask her about the 2020 presidential election and if she believes that the election was rigged in favor of Joe Biden. And she really did not want to answer that question other than to say, that she's seen no evidence of that it was rigged in Biden's favor, and wanted to move on to other topics. She said she'd love President Trump's endorsement, as I'm sure, all of them would. And then you have Casey Schliebik, who's a Polish immigrant who's run a couple of times for Senate. He, talked about how, he did seem to support, immigration reform as far as, like, following what the law is now. But, for certain folks kind of who've been in the country, without legal permission, maybe, trying to work something, what a lot of you hear from some Republicans and many Democrats, try to work something out for people who've lived in the country, who are non-citizens for a long time, instead of just kicking them out, and which is what we're seeing, a lot with Customs and Border Patrol and ICE, as they're coming, to Chicago and other Democratic run cities. So I talked about that. There were times where, he repeatedly asked the moderator to repeat the question. I believe when he was asked a question about federal minimum wage, he kept talking about immigration. So there were some hiccups from all the candidates. That was probably the most noticeable one, other than Jeannie Evans, It doesn't say on her, it didn't say on her website at the time. I haven't checked since that she identifies as a Republican. So
Okay.
when I asked her about that, she's like, "That's very slick, and we will get on that right away." Um, but other than that, I think that there is an acknowledgement among them that whoever wins the primary
Hmm.
is going to have an uphill battle because Illinois is a blue state, and the Democrats are clearly much better funded. So they know that it's going to be difficult, but at the same time, they still feel like they're best equipped to handle Illinois' interests. And I know like Jeannie Evans, for example, she's kind of branding herself as a fresh face. She's
Hmm.
really pushing for her issues, really deal with she's really like a champion for small businesses. I believe she's helped small businesses in her line of work. And also she calls herself basically a free market capitalist,
Hmm.
or champion of free markets. So those are really that's really kind of the platform she's running on. Um, and then, Don Tracy, is former head of the Illinois Republican Party. He's got that experience. He's actually run for office a few times. So I guess the point is that, Evans is trying to say, unlike my two opponents, I'm a fresh face. These two
Hmm.
have run for office unsuccessfully, and I'm the person you should stand behind. So that's kind of what we've, seen so far from these candidates. But definitely the Democratic primary is really kind of overshadowed anything
Hmm.
because Dick Durbin has held that seat for so long and he is a Democrat. So that's
Hmm.
obviously the primary that continues to dominate all the attention
Yeah,
when in the U.S. Senate race.
definitely. Yeah, that's the one I keep getting press releases from both Lieutenant Governor Stratton and from Mr. Krishnamurthy. And I just wanted to wrap up what you said there. I watched because I haven't been able to find out much about Ms. Evans, and I had interviewed Mr. Tracy, and I was struck. That was the thing I heard, that she's a lawyer. And then Mr. Shelbeck, how he had to have those questions repeated. And they seem to be a little pragmatic on that approach. Like, I think they understand that Illinois is not as, I guess, MAGA as the some of the national politics might have it laid out there. So I guess we'll have to see what happens
Right.
on election day.
Right, exactly. And they were kind of walking a fine line there, right? Like they were kind
Hmm.
of acknowledging different approaches they would have to President Trump, but in concept, but they didn't want to say anything negative about him. I mean, they
Hmm.
either. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not to get too far into the weeds, but in an interesting way, it seemed to be a little bit more. What I think about is the Senate is the deliberative body, and so maybe there's a bit of, in a way, they're kind of forced into that being deliberative and not,
Right.
like their representatives.
Right.
So all right, well, I guess we're gonna have to got an interesting month ahead of us and see who comes ahead. We have just about 2 minutes left, and I want to wrap up as we overnight we got news that Jesse Jackson had passed away. He died at 84. My lifetime here in Illinois, I live closer to Chicago, and he was part of, my understanding of news. I just wanted to talk to each of you. Peter, do you ever have a chance to interact with Mr. Jackson?
I did actually. It was very brief. I was working in Topeka, Kansas at the time, and I want to say it was around maybe the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court case that desegregated public schools. They were dedicating a National Historic Site in Topeka at the time, and there was a reception. I was working at a public radio station, so I went to this reception, and I remember putting a microphone up to his face and asking him some sort of question, and immediately thinking, this man has had so many microphones put in his
Mm-hmm.
face. He's had so many young, naive reporters like me ask him questions. Nothing I ask him is ever going to be remembered. He's not going to remember me 10 seconds after he turns around. But he was very gracious. I asked
Mm-hmm.
him some question. He gave me an answer. I was able to insert it into
Mm-hmm.
a story for the next morning that made it sound like I interviewed this iconic national civil rights leader. So it stuck out in my memory. I doubt very much that it stuck out in his.
We've got about 1 minute left, probably about 45 seconds. Jeremy, you talked a little bit about covering him. What kind of a person was he? Approachable? With about 30 seconds left.
Very approachable. Used to see him in the Chicago Tribune newsroom all the time before we left Tribune Tower. He was always there. But yeah, I mean, he always was somebody you'd see around town championing causes, related to gun violence, police misconduct allegations. I mean, I remember him getting arrested outside a pretty well-known gun shop where local law enforcement had traced illegal guns onto Chicago streets. He was very, that was a big deal down there. But and I remember seeing him as, in 2018, when they had an anti-violence protest on the Dan Ryan Expressway. Remember talking to him before that, about his thoughts there. And even not just Chicago, but you'd see him nationally. It's for similar causes in cities across America. So he is somebody who will be sorely missed.
Yeah. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. And that's it for this week's edition of Capitol View.